There is a moment that almost everyone who has been in a relationship with a narcissist knows intimately. And it is not the moment of the cruelty itself, though that moment is real and its damage is lasting. It is the moment after. The moment when the narcissist, having said the thing that cannot be unsaid, having done the thing that cannot be undone, simply withdraws, goes quiet, creates distance with a thoroughness and a coldness that feels to the person left on the other side of it, like a second injury layered directly on top of the first. And the question that almost nobody asks clearly enough is why? What is actually happening inside a person when they cause significant harm to someone they claim to love and then retreat from that person, rather than toward them? Because our instinct, the instinct of anyone who loves with any genuine depth, is to move toward the person we have hurt, to repair, to acknowledge, to sit in the discomfort of what we have caused and allow that discomfort to do its work on us. That is what healthy shame does. Healthy shame in this distinction is absolutely critical. Healthy shame is the emotion that says I did something that does not align with who I am and clears throat, who I want to be. It is oriented toward repair. It is relational. It pulls us back into connection with the person we have wronged, because connection is precisely where the repair can happen. But the narcissist does not experience healthy shame. They experience toxic shame. And the difference between those two things is not merely semantic. It is the difference between an emotion that heals and an emotion that destroys. Toxic shame does not say I did something bad. It says I am something bad. It does not locate the problem in the behavior. It locates it in the self, in the very core of identity. And for the narcissist, whose entire psychological architecture was constructed specifically to ensure that core wound was never felt, never surfaced, never brought into the light, the experience of toxic shame is not uncomfortable. It is existentially unbearable. It threatens to collapse the false self entirely, to crack the armor down to its foundation and expose what lies beneath it. That original ancient belief that they are fundamentally defective, fundamentally unlovable, fundamentally not enough. And so the narcissist does the only thing their psychology knows how to do in that moment. They run, not physically necessarily, though sometimes that too. They run emotionally. They create distance. They go cold. They manufacture silence as a barrier between themselves and the unbearable interior experience that your pain, your legitimate and entirely justified pain, is forcing them to brush up against. Here is what makes this so particularly cruel in its effect. Even though cruelty in any conscious sense is rarely the intention, the withdrawal looks from the outside exactly like remorse. It looks like someone so devastated by what they have done they cannot face you. And that appearance, that convincing painful appearance, activates every compassionate instinct the empath possesses. It says to the person who was hurt, perhaps they feel it too. Perhaps this silence is grief. Perhaps if I give them space, they will come back transformed, ready to acknowledge what happened, ready to make it right. But the silence is not grief for what was done to you. It is the management of an internal experience that has everything to do with the narcissist's own psychological survival and almost nothing to do with you at all. The narcissist's withdrawal after harm is not the beginning of accountability. It is the avoidance of it. Now that we understand what the withdrawal is not, that it is not remorse, not grief, not the beginning of any genuine reckoning with what was done, we need to look even more carefully at what it actually is. Because the narcissist's distance is never simply an absence. It is never passive, and one of the most important perceptual shifts a person can make in understanding this dynamic is to stop reading the withdrawal as emptiness and start reading it as architecture, as structure, as something that was built not necessarily with conscious intention, but with precise psychological function. The distance is a power move, and it works with devastating efficiency. Let us think about what happens in the emotional landscape of a relationship the moment the narcissist withdraws. Before the withdrawal, however the harm was caused, there was at least the texture of engagement. Even conflict, even cruelty, even the painful dissonance of the devaluation stage carries within it a kind of relational presence. The narcissist is there reactive, volatile perhaps, hurtful certainly, but there. And for someone whose nervous system has been conditioned over months, or years, or decades, to orient around the narcissist's emotional state, that presence, however painful, is at least legible. At least the terrain is known. The withdrawal removes all of that. Suddenly, the person who was harmed finds themselves not just dealing with the original injury, but suspended in a relational void that the nervous system experiences as profoundly destabilizing. The emotional ground has disappeared, and into that void rushes something extraordinarily powerful. The need to restore equilibrium, the need to make contact, the need to close the gap and return to something, anything that feels like solid relational ground again. And this is what the withdrawal was designed at the level of unconscious psychological strategy to produce. Because think about what the narcissist has achieved with their silence. They have taken a situation in which they were unambiguously in the wrong, in which they caused harm that if properly examined might lead the other person to question the relationship, to establish boundaries, to withdraw their own emotional availability, and they have completely inverted the power dynamic. Suddenly, the person who was hurt is the one pursuing, the one reaching out, the one desperate to restore connection. And the narcissist in their silence holds all the cards. They decide when the distance ends. They decide when warmth returns. They control the emotional thermostat of the entire relationship from a position of apparent passivity. This is what makes it a power play of such particular sophistication. It requires no visible effort. It makes no overt demands. It carries none of the risk of open confrontation. It simply withdraws and then waits with the confidence of long experience for the other person's attachment system to do all the work. For the other person's fear of abandonment, their longing for resolution, their deep and genuine love, to propel them across the distance that the narcissist created. And when that reaching out happens, when the person who was hurt makes the first contact, offers the first olive branch, asks the first tentative question about whether things are all right, something shifts in the dynamic that is almost never named. The original harm quietly disappears from view. It is not addressed. It is not acknowledged. It is simply absorbed into the resume texture of the relationship, as though the withdrawal were the injury that needed repairing, rather than the behavior that preceded it. The narcissist's silence does not communicate regret. It communicates ownership. And until we see it clearly, we will keep responding to it as though it were an invitation to heal, when it is in truth a demand to submit. We have established that the withdrawal is shame management. We have established that it functions as a silent power play of considerable sophistication. Now we need to go somewhere that feels counterintuitive, somewhere that when I name it directly might produce a kind of uncomfortable recognition in people who have lived inside this dynamic for any significant length of time. Because beneath the narcissist's withdrawal, beneath the cold silence and the manufactured distance, there is something that the narcissists themselves would never consciously acknowledge. Something that their entire false self was constructed to never have to admit. They are desperate. Not desperate in the way the person they hurt is desperate, not with the open, honest, relationally grounded longing of someone who loves and fears losing what they love. The narcissist's desperation is a different creature entirely. It is buried. It is disguised. It is wrapped in the appearance of indifference so convincingly that even the narcissist, at a conscious level, may genuinely believe the performance. But beneath the silence, beneath the carefully maintained distance, the narcissist is waiting, watching, monitoring with an attentiveness that never actually switches off whether the person they withdrew from is going to do what every person before them has done. Reach out, close the gap, restore the supply. And we need to understand what supply means in this context, because it is the key to everything. We established earlier in this conversation that the narcissist's false self requires constant external feeding to maintain its structure. It cannot generate its own sense of worth, its own emotional stability, its own confirmation of reality from within. Because the interior world of the narcissist is dominated by that original wound, that toxic shame, that bottomless well of I am not enough that the entire architecture of narcissism was built to wall off. So the validation, the attention, the emotional engagement of the people around them is not for the narcissist a preference or a pleasure. It is a psychological necessity. It is oxygen. And when the narcissist withdraws after causing harm, what they have done functionally, structurally, is cut off their own supply. The distance they created to manage their shame has simultaneously removed them from the source. the external validation their psychological system depends on, which means that behind every hour of that silence, something is building a pressure, a need that the false self cannot articulate but cannot ignore, a hunger that grows quietly and insistently in the background of all that performed indifference. This is why the hoovering, that eventual return, that reaching back across the distance, with charm or apology or manufactured vulnerability, is not a choice in any fully conscious sense. It is a compulsion. The narcissist returns not because they have reflected, not because they have examined what they did and arrived at genuine accountability, but because the need for supply has reached a level that the withdrawal can no longer be sustained against. The false self has been running on empty, and it needs to be fed. Now, here is what I need you to sit with, because it reframes the entire experience of being on the receiving end of this dynamic. The narcissist's desperation behind their distance means that the power in this situation is not where it appears to be. It appears to rest with the person who is withholding, with the one who controls the silence, who decides when contact resumes. But the narcissist is not withholding from a position of fullness. They are withholding from a position of profound structural emptiness. The narcissist's silence is not strength wearing the costume of indifference. It is need wearing the costume of power. We have now looked carefully at what is happening inside the narcissist during the withdrawal. We have seen the shame management, the silent power play, the desperate hunger that hides behind performed indifference. And now we need to turn the lens in the other direction. Because the narcissist's psychology, as important as it is to understand, is only one half of this equation. The other half, the half that is almost never examined with the depth and the compassion it deserves, is what is happening inside the person who was hurt. Inside the person who was hurt. Inside the person who was sitting with the silence, feeling the withdrawal and experiencing something that from the outside might look like simply missing someone, but from the inside feels like something far more urgent, far more physical, far more frighteningly beyond their control. Because the pull to reach out, that almost irresistible compulsion to close the gap, to break the silence, to restore contact with the very person who caused the harm and then disappeared, is not a character flaw. It is not neediness in any punishable sense. It is not weakness. It is not desperation. And it is most certainly not evidence that the person who feels it lacks self-respect or intelligence or dignity. It is a trauma response. A deeply wired, physiologically grounded, psychologically understandable trauma response. And until we name it as that, until we extend to ourselves the same clinical compassion we might extend to any person whose nervous system is responding to a perceived threat, we will continue to judge ourselves for something that was never within. The simple reach of willpower or intention to control. Here is what is actually happening. From the very earliest chapters of human life, our nervous system is wired around one foundational principle. Proximity to a safe attachment figure means survival. Distance from that figure means danger. This is not metaphor. In infancy, in early childhood, this is literal biological truth. The caregiver who is present, warm, and responsive is the difference between life and death. And the nervous system, in its profound intelligence, encodes this truth so deeply, so fundamentally, that it never entirely outgrows it. Even in adulthood, even in old age, even after decades of lived experience that consciously tells us we are capable of surviving alone, the older, deeper part of the nervous system still responds to sudden relational withdrawal with something that resembles panic, with cortisol, with hypervigilance, with a desperate, almost cellular imperative to restore connection. Now add to this foundational wiring, the specific conditioning of a narcissistic relationship. Because what the narcissist cycle does over time and with terrible efficiency is attach the nervous system survival response not to a safe, reliable attachment figure, but to an unpredictable one. The intermittent reinforcement of the idealization and devaluation stages the cycle of warmth and coldness, closeness and withdrawal, love bombing and contempt, creates a trauma bond. A bond that is paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened by inconsistency. Because the nervous system, when it cannot predict when safety will arrive, does not detach and move on. It intensifies its vigilance. It becomes more attuned, more watchful, more desperate to read and respond to the emotional signals of the person it has identified as the source of both the threat and the relief. This is why the withdrawal hits with such disproportionate force. It is not simply the loss of this relationship in this moment that the nervous system is responding to. It is every abandonment, every disappearance, every moment of conditional love that was ever experienced, all of it activated simultaneously by one person's silence. You are not weak for feeling this. You are human with a history and a nervous system that learned to survive it. We have traveled deep into the psychology of this dynamic, into the narcissist's shame, their strategic silence, their hidden desperation, and into the trauma response that makes the withdrawal feel so physically unbearable to the person on the receiving end of it. And now I want to do something that this conversation rarely does. I want to bring it fully into the body, because everything we have discussed so far has been to some degree about the mind, about psychological patterns and attachment systems and conditioned responses. But the body is not a passive bystander in any of this. The body is in the room. The body is keeping score. And for those of us who have spent years or decades inside these dynamics, the body has been keeping score for a very long time. Let us be precise about what the narcissist's withdrawal actually does at a physiological level, because it is not simply unpleasant. It is not merely emotionally uncomfortable in the way that any relational difficulty is uncomfortable. It is a genuine stressor in the biological sense of that word, meaning it activates the body's threat response system with measurable, documentable consequences that extend far beyond the duration of the silence itself. When the narcissist withdraws, the nervous system of the person they have left in that silence registers the absence as threat.
The amygdala,
that ancient pre-rational part of the brain whose entire function is threat detection and survival, does not distinguish between physical danger and relational danger. It does not know the difference between a predator and a person who has gone cold and silent. It knows only that something essential to survival has been withdrawn, and it responds accordingly. Cortisol floods the system. Adrenaline follows. The heart rate elevates. Sleep becomes fragmented and unrestorative. The digestive system, which is exquisitely sensitive to stress in ways that medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate, begins to disregard. The immune system, which requires a state of relative physiological calm to do its extraordinary and complex work, is suppressed. And all of this happens not because of a single episode of silence, but because of the cumulative weight of every episode that came before it. Because this is not, for most people in narcissistic relationships, the first withdrawal. It is one in a long sequence, and each one lands on a nervous system that never fully recovered from the last one. Each one adds its layer of cortisol, its measure of inflammatory response, its contribution to the chronic low-grade physiological dysregulation. That is the body's way of saying this environment is not safe, and I have been trying to tell you that for longer than you know. For older adults, this calculus becomes even more urgent and even more concrete, because the body at 60, at 70, at 80 does not have the same physiological reserves it had at 30. The nervous system that has spent years in hypervigilance, always braced, always scanning, always preparing for the next withdrawal or the next explosion or the next cycle of warmth and coldness, is a nervous system operating significantly below its optimal capacity, and the consequences of that are not abstract. They manifest as cardiovascular strain, as autoimmune flares, as the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that sleep does not touch, as cognitive fog that makes the already disorienting experience of narcissistic abuse even harder to think clearly through. There is something that I find both painful and critically important to name here. Many older adults who have spent years in narcissistic relationships attribute their declining health entirely to aging. They accept the fatigue, the anxiety, the physical symptoms as the inevitable cost of growing older. And sometimes that attribution is partially correct. But sometimes, more often than medicine currently acknowledges, what they are experiencing is not simply the body aging. It is the body finally presenting the full bill for years of chronic relational stress that was never allowed to be named for what it was. Your body was not failing you. It was faithfully, accurately, and at enormous cost to itself, reporting the truth of what you were living through. We have named what the withdrawal does to the body. We have sat with the physiological reality of what years of narcissistic silence costs a person at the cellular level. And now I want to offer something that I believe is one of the most practically transformative shifts a person can make in their relationship with this dynamic. Not a technique, not a strategy in the tactical sense, but a fundamental reorientation in how we read the narcissist distance. Because how we read it determines everything about how we respond to it. And how we respond to it determines whether we remain inside the cycle or whether we begin, perhaps for the first time, to step outside it. We have been taught by our own longing, by the distorting lens of the trauma bond, by years of having our perceptions systematically undermined, to read the narcissist's silence as a question, as an open, unresolved question that we are responsible for answering, as something that requires our interpretation, our response, our reaching across the distance to give it meaning. The silence feels incomplete. It feels like a sentence without an ending, a door left ajar, a conversation suspended mid-breath. And because it feels that way, we pour ourselves into the gap. We fill it with speculation, with self-blame, with the exhausting mental labor of trying to decode what the silence means and what we must do to end it. But what if the silence is not a question at all? What if it is in fact an answer? This is the perceptual shift I want to offer. Because the narcissist's withdrawal, when we strip away the distortion of hope and fear and look at it with clear, steady eyes, is one of the most information-rich communications the relationship will ever produce. It tells us with a precision that no amount of conversation or confrontation or couples therapy has been able to match exactly what we are dealing with. A person who responds to causing harm by creating distance is telling us something fundamental about their capacity for genuine intimacy. A person who uses silence as leverage is telling us something irreplaceable about how they understand relationship. A person who disappears precisely when their presence, their accountability, their willingness to sit in comfort is most needed is telling us clearly and completely where their psychological limits actually lie. The tragedy is that we have been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt our own perception that we cannot receive this information cleanly. Every time we approach a clear reading of the silence, the trauma bond intervenes. The memory of the idealization stage surfaces. The hope that this withdrawal will be different, that this time the return will bring genuine reflection and real change clouds the signal. And so we remain in the interpretive fog, unable to read clearly what is being communicated with absolute consistency right in front of us. Learning to read the silence clearly is not a cynical act. I want to be precise about that because there is a version of this conversation that collapses into bitterness, into a blanket condemnation of the narcissist as irredeemably broken and therefore deserving of nothing but contempt. That is not what I am describing. Understanding what the withdrawal communicates does not require us to stop caring about the person who withdrew. It does not require hatred or hardness. It requires only honesty, the particular courageous. Honesty of seeing what is actually there rather than what we need to be there. And when we can do that, when we can read the silence for what it is, rather than for what we wish it were, we take back something the narcissist's dynamic has been systematically removing from us for as long as we have been inside it. When you learn to read the silence accurately, you stop trying to rewrite it. And that is when your healing actually begins. We have arrived at the place in this conversation that everything before it has been quietly building toward. And I want to approach it carefully because it is the place where most people either find their way out of this dynamic or remain inside it indefinitely. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack awareness, but because this particular step requires something that years inside a narcissistic relationship have been specifically and systematically designed to erode. It requires trust, not trust in the narcissist. We have moved well beyond that. Trust in yourself, trust in your own perception, your own reading of the silence, your own capacity to tolerate the discomfort of not closing a gap. That every conditioned instinct in your nervous system is screaming at you to close. Because the most powerful response to the narcissist's withdrawal is also the simplest. And the simplest things, as anyone who has done any genuine psychological work knows, are almost never the easiest. Do not reach out. I want to sit with that for a moment because stated so plainly, it can sound like a tactic, like a game, like the kind of advice that reduces a profound psychological dynamic to a matter of who blinks first. And I need to be absolutely clear that what I am describing has nothing to do with tactics or games or any desire to manipulate the narcissist behavior in return. What I am describing is something categorically different. It is the act of remaining present with yourself fully consciously without distraction at precisely the moment when every conditioned pattern you carry is urging you to abandon yourself in favor of restoring someone else's comfort. This is what non-engagement actually means at a psychological level. It is not silence as punishment. It is not distance as retaliation. It is the decision made not in anger, but in a clarity that has been hard-worn through everything we have examined together in this conversation to allow the narcissist's withdrawal to simply be what it is without rushing to resolve it, without interpreting it as a crisis that requires your immediate intervention, without feeding the dynamic that depends entirely on your fear of the gap being greater than your trust in your own wholeness. And here is what happens when that decision is made and held. When the person who was hurt does not reach out, does not close the distance, does not provide the reassurance that the narcissist system was designed to extract the entire strategic framework of the withdrawal collapses. Because the withdrawal, as we established, is not passive. It is a structure. It is a carefully, if unconsciously constructed architecture of pressure and expectation built on the reliable foundation of the other person's conditioned response. Remove that response, and the architecture has nothing to stand on. The silence that was designed to be unbearable becomes instead simply silence. The distance that was calibrated to provoke pursuit becomes instead simply space. And in that space, in the quiet that opens up when you stop filling it with frantic labor of managing someone else's psychology, something begins to shift inside you. But Chachin, no longer consumed by the hypervigilant task of monitoring the narcissist's emotional weather, begins tentatively and slowly to regulate itself. The cognitive fog that chronic relational stress produces begins to lift fractionally, incrementally, and thoughts that could not find their way through the noise of the dynamic begin to surface. Honest thoughts, clear thoughts, thoughts about what you actually feel, what you actually need, what you actually deserve from the relationships that occupy the remaining chapters of your life. Refusing to close the gap is not abandoning the relationship. It is the first time, perhaps in a very long time, that you choose yourself instead. And so we arrive at the final destination of this conversation, not the end, because what we are talking about is never really an ending. It is always a beginning, but the place where everything we have examined together crystallizes into something actionable, something livable, something that can be carried out of this room and into the actual texture of daily life. We have mapped the narcissist's withdrawal with precision. We have understood its mechanics, its function, its hidden desperation. We have looked unflinchingly at what it does to the body, to the nervous system, to the identity of the person who has been living inside its orbit. We have talked about reading the silence clearly and about the profound power of refusing to close the gap. And now we need to talk about what happens in that space, what you actually do with the distance when you stop trying to collapse it. Because the narcissist withdrawal reframes seen not through the lens of punishment or abandonment, but through the lens of psychological clarity, is something genuinely unexpected. It is an opening. It is perhaps for the first time in the relationship an unguarded moment in which the narcissist's constant gravitational pull on your attention, your energy, your sense of self is temporarily suspended. And what that suspension makes possible if we can resist the conditioned urge to fill it immediately with pursuit is the most important work a human being can do at any stage of life, particularly in the later stages, particularly when the years remaining feel more precious and more finite than they once did. The work of coming home to yourself. Now, I want to be honest about what that phrase means because it is used so frequently in therapeutic and spiritual contexts that it has begun to lose its weight. Coming home to yourself is not a meditation retreat. It is not a journaling practice, though both of those things can serve it. It is not the adoption of a new identity constructed in opposition to the narcissist. I am now the person who does not need them, who is above this, who has transcended the wound. That is not homecoming. That is another performance, another false self built on different foundations, but with the same fundamental dishonesty. Coming home to yourself is the willingness to meet in the quiet that the narcissist's withdrawal has accidentally provided. The person who was there before the relationship began its work of dismantling you. The person who had opinions that were not filtered through the narcissist's approval. The person who had preferences, instincts, ways of moving through the world that belonged entirely and authentically to them. The person who knew at some level what they felt before years of gaslighting taught them to outsource that knowledge to someone else's version of reality. This reunion is not always comfortable. In fact, it is often profoundly disorienting at first because the self that was systematically dismantled did not disappear. It went underground. And what went underground did not remain static. It accumulated every suppressed feeling, every swallowed truth, every moment of self-betrayal in service of managing the narcissist's reality. All of it is waiting in that quiet space, and meeting it requires a quality of self-compassion that the narcissistic relationship was specifically designed to make impossible. The relationship told you in 1,000 subtle and not so subtle ways that your inner world was not to be trusted, that your feelings were too much, or wrong, or manipulative, or imagined. Coming home means deciding perhaps for the first time with full, conscious commitment that you trust yourself instead. For those of us in the later chapters of life, this homecoming carries a particular urgency and a particular tenderness. Because we are not coming home to build a life from scratch. We are coming home to inhabit fully and without apology the life that is actually here. The relationships that are genuine, the pleasures that are simple and real. The quiet dignity of a self that was never actually destroyed, only temporarily and without its consent displaced. The narcissist's withdrawal gave you distance. What you do with that distance is entirely, completely, and irrevocably yours.